Hi everybody, let's in this video consider another policy that has the intentions of promoting efficient outcomes. This is the policy of nationalisation, which is the process of taking an industry into public ownership. So it's the government that's buying up assets or industry from the private sector and running services themselves, running the industry themselves. Okay, so this is when the industry is completely in the hands of the public sector, of the government. Well, let's have a look at arguments in favour and arguments against before coming to some key evaluation points throughout the essay and especially in your judgment. What are the arguments in favour of nationalisation? Well, if we have a state-run monopoly, the state that's dominating the industry here, then you can argue there are greater potential for economies of scale, huge economies of scale, to be had in certain industries. Well, that is going to lead to productive efficiency gains, lower average costs and potentially lower prices to consumers. That's the way you can argue that one. The public sector is going to focus more on service provision. That's the assumption that we make, isn't it? That governments will always look to maximise social welfare and fulfil the needs and wants of society. So if there is nationalisation, state-run companies, you'd expect that whatever consumers want, whatever society desires, the needs and wants of society is likely to be met. That is allocative efficiency benefits, and crucially at a price that is low, which maximises consumer surplus. You can argue that there is less likely to be market failures that arise from positive and negative externalities. Why? Because again, the government intends to maximise social welfare, and that means considering the full social cost and social benefit when it comes to producing, not just private benefit and private cost. As a result, you would expect that quantity levels or output levels are more likely to resemble the socially optimum level of production, whereby society is getting exactly the quantity that they want in production, minimising overproduction and underproduction issues that we might have had in the private sector. Therefore, allocative efficiency gains, you can argue, is likely to be the end result, more likely to be the result than in the private sector, due to the self-interest of private sector firms. You can also say that the public sector can be a great vehicle for macroeconomic control in two ways. You know, if we allow for more nationalisation and more public sector companies operating, then governments can actually manipulate wages to keep inflation under control. So if inflation is overshooting the target, the public sector can maintain pay rises or can even enact pay cuts, which can bring inflation back down towards the target. But it can also control employment levels. So if we're in the recession phase of the economic cycle, the public sector can look to employ more workers to keep the unemployment rate low in a period of recession. What about arguments against nationalisation? Well, a very good argument is to bring in the risk of diseconomies of scale. If the public sector is dominating an industry and there is a state-run monopoly here, that company could be absolutely huge, and therefore the risk of diseconomies of scale creeping in is also quite large. So problems of coordination, communication, motivation, as we've covered in previous videos, could well take place, which could lead to increasing average costs. It can lead to a loss of productive efficiency gains, and therefore can lead to higher prices in the end for consumers. Not a good thing. Of course, there is a lack of an incentive for state-run companies to minimise costs. Linked to that is the risk of complacency and wasteful production creeping into the production process. Both of these points can link to higher costs than what there should be. Point number 3 links to X inefficiency. But you can say generally higher costs of production of state-run companies, because they lack a profit motive, they lack an incentive to reduce costs. The end result will be inefficiency, in particular X inefficiency, maybe even productive inefficiency, and higher prices for the consumer at the end. So a lack of a profit motive means there is a lack of an incentive to minimise costs of production. With a lack of profit motive, of course, we are likely to see lower supernormal profits being made in nationalised industry compared to privatised industry. And that means that dynamic inefficiency is going to be the end result. We don't see the technology gains, the innovation benefits, the research and development gains that we see when supernormal profits are reinvested back into the company. You might say that privatised firms are more likely to engage in reinvestment, to take opportunities, to innovate, and therefore be dynamically efficient, whereas state-run companies less likely to do so. Not good for the consumer in the long run here. You could argue, yes, a big point, that nationalisation is very, very expensive, and it's a burden that the taxpayer will have to shoulder. Running state companies is an extremely expensive thing to do. Maintaining them, paying wages, for example, buying the assets from the private sector in the first place is a very expensive thing to do. It's the taxpayer that will shoulder that burden. And you can argue that in a period of austerity right now, or when budget deficits are very high and they want to be brought down, when national debts are high, excessive and out of control, can the government really afford to run services like this, or to nationalise industries like this? It's a strong argument to make. And if they do decide to nationalise industries, you can always bring in the opportunity cost argument. Could there have been better benefits by using taxpayers' money in other areas? Could there have been a better rate of return by using taxpayers' money in different areas compared to nationalising this particular industry, whatever industry it might be in your essay that you're applying to? Number 6 is a very, very important point. The lack of competition if the state is dominating an industry could mean higher prices due to a lack of competitive drive. So higher prices, lower quantities, you might just see monopoly outcomes that you're trying to prevent taking place because there isn't a competitive drive that keeps the company under control, that maintains efficiency basically in this industry. The end result? Allocative inefficiency. Exactly what we don't want to see. There is a risk of that because of a lack of competition. This is a nice point to make, the greater risk of moral hazard. Remember what moral hazard is. This is when individuals that take the risk do not bear the costs of the risk if the risks actually go wrong. The costs are borne by the third party if the decision goes wrong. So a good example of this is politicians. You know, politicians or state-controlled managers or owners are the ones that make risky decisions, and they might be risk happy to take risks, because if that decision then goes wrong, maybe it's an investment decision, a big investment decision, billions of pounds worth of investment maybe, that goes wrong and fails dramatically, it's not going to be that individual that bears the cost, is it? It's going to be the taxpayer that has to bear the cost of a poor investment decision, or of a state-run company going into bankruptcy or making huge losses as a result of an excessive risk being taken. So the risk of moral hazard will then end up being a problem that the taxpayer will have to share the burden of and have to bail the company out of, right? So the taxpayer bears the burden of moral hazard. And also, a big risk of political priorities overriding commercial issues here. And this is where maybe politicians who need to engage in investment decisions for this state-run monopoly decide not to because of the risk involved. Even though investment is necessary to improve capacity maybe, to improve quality, whatever it might be, it's necessary in that state-run industry. They decide not to do it because there is risk. Potential risk it might go wrong, even though the benefits could outweigh the risk. The reason why they might not to do it is because next year there's an election. And they think, well look, if there's a risk of this investment going wrong, I'd rather not take the risk now when there is an election coming up next year. So they decide not to do it because their political priorities overcome what society demands, i.e. the commercial issues. Even though society needs that investment to take place, they don't do it because their political priorities come first. Not a good thing at all. So, having understood the points for and against, let's look at evaluative points. Before we look at those, key thing to say, guys, these are all general arguments. Remember, you must apply them to a given industry depending on what you're arguing for, depending on what your exam question requires of you. And also, a lot of the points, on the other hand, will contradict some of the points on the one hand. So just make sure that the points you're making actually make sense and they don't contradict each other too much, otherwise you look like you're just regurgitating points in your paper as opposed to applying correct ideas to whatever case study or whatever example that you are talking about. So evaluative considerations. Throughout your essay and especially in your judgment, what kind of points can you consider in evaluation? Well, you can always bring in the funding versus the delivery of key public services argument here. So yes, nationalisation has got a huge cost that the taxpayer has got to share the burden of. But if actually the end result is that society gets a better delivery of key public services than in the private sector, you might argue it's worth it. But vice versa, maybe you argue it's not worth it. Are PPPs better than full nationalisation? Remember, PPPs are public-private partnerships, where maybe the private sector pays for the construction and the maintenance of a project, whereas the public sector pays the private sector to rent it and to use it. So maybe you argue public-private sector partnerships are better because you get the best of both, don't you? You get the private sector and the efficiency gains that come with that, the minimization of costs that come with that, and you get the nationalisation, the benefits of that as well, which is the maintaining of public services to make sure that service quality is high, to make sure that quantity is high, choice is high, that the services that society wants we are offering, that prices are kept low. You get those benefits of nationalisation too. So maybe public-private partnerships are better than going full nationalisation and taking on the huge cost of full nationalisation. You might argue that you don't need to go full nationalisation if there is strong regulation of private sector industries. Maybe that's a better way of dealing with it instead of having to nationalise the entire industry. You might argue that, look, if there is competition in the private sector, the end results are going to be better than if you nationalise the industry. So you can argue, look, if there is high competition in the private sector, you don't need to worry about it. If you are concerned, just make sure there is a good regulator doing their job in that industry. But you don't necessarily need to go full nationalisation if there is good competition. If there isn't competition, highly concentrated markets which are not being resolved by regulation in the private sector, maybe then you can argue, okay, nationalisation might be a better way forward here. Also consider the size and the objective of private sector firms as to whether nationalisation is necessary. So if private sector firms are large and are really benefiting from huge economies of scale, you might argue that actually that is a benefit which is worthwhile keeping instead of going towards nationalisation where firms might get too big and diseconomies of scale creep in. So when you talk about size of firms and you're critiquing size, link very much to economies of scale arguments. Where are we likely to see the better economies of scale? In the private sector or in the public sector? And also consider the objectives of firms. Not all private sector firms are profit maximising. We've covered that in a previous video. You might get private sector firms who strive for allocative efficiency. Well, that's not a concern, is it? You might get private sector firms who are concerned about corporate and social responsibility. Well, that's good for society as well. So it's no guarantee that private sector firms are always going to be profit maximising and trying to exploit consumers and harm the public interest. There is no guarantee at all. We need to look at the objectives of firms first before we consider whether nationalising really is the best approach. So that covers everything you need for a big essay on nationalisation, guys. Remember to apply this to a case study, to an example, to whatever market your exam question requires, and you are likely to rock this essay. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you all in the next video.